Welcome back to Treasury Talks. We are excited today to have MC Khristina with us. Back from this summer, we originally talked about MetaPlanet. It's been blowing up on our YouTube videos. People really gravitated towards the video, a lot of conviction. Obviously, MetaPlanet, Japanese community around that has flocked to your videos, which is always cool to see that traffic. We also have Brian Rothenberg, consistent community guest and one of the really inspirations for this show, having real people unattached to any treasury company just talking about what their investments are. So Khristina, Brian, welcome, especially you, Khristina. We'll start out here. How are you?
I'm good. Probably less good than I was in July with my, the performance of the Bitcoin treasury companies, but I'm here, I'm still standing. And I do still own both MetaPlanet and SmarterWeb.
And Brian.
Welcome. Yeah. Likewise. Thank you. Yeah. Hoping for the best. It is the toughest market to be a holder of these companies is chopping sideways. And even this week, it's like, where did the last week go? We're still chopping sideways. We're really not up or down. So
right. But I do think it's easier to hold in the chop of the sideways than it is to hold when it's just like down every day.
Oh, yes. Well, the stocks, yes. Bitcoin being chopping sideways is partly what I think is pushing the stocks down, I guess is my point, because there's things you can do with volatility both directions. So, but yeah, it's been tough to be an investor in these companies, and you wonder if you made the right choices. But yeah, let's jump into that, I guess.
Yeah. I guess while we're doing full disclosures, this is not financial advice. I too have not sold any MetaPlanet or SmarterWeb or strategy, but I haven't been the best trader. I'm sitting on these. I think they're long-term. So we're excited to jump in today. I think, Khristina, you've done a very commendable job of just being open and honest about what your trading thoughts are, your journey. So really excited to unpack that today for the audience. I think people are trying to find ways to understand, hey, what do I do with these underwater positions? Or, hey, how do I look at this going forward? How do I find conviction? So you've been very transparent. What have you learned about managing this conviction in this new sector? Like, what have you learned about this brand new Bitcoin treasury company, sector as a whole from a retail investor perspective?
Right. Well, I think we're learning every day, right? It's a relatively new sector outside of MicroStrategy, which I still own MicroStrategy. I kind of think of MicroStrategy, though, in a little bit of a separate bucket, just because they're so much bigger and so much more mature as a company than I do MetaPlanet and SmarterWeb. And that's kind of why I mentioned those two first and didn't mention MicroStrategy, because I do think of them pretty differently. But in terms of managing conviction, I think for me, it's really more about managing emotions and expectations now. I think I mismanaged my MetaPlanet position, and I wrote it all the way up and all the way down because I became so emotionally invested in the company. Up until I doxed myself in April as a speaker at the Bitwise Investor Day on a panel, I was happily, kind of anonymous and doing my thing, trading stocks and options, and really mostly non-Bitcoin outside of MicroStrategy. And then I invested in MetaPlanet in May, went to Bitcoin Vegas in June. I met Dylan, I met his parents. I adore his mother. She made cookies. We were messaging with each other. I was so active in the Discord community and becoming a part of that community, and put so much time into, understanding like this new position, this new community, educating myself about the trading dynamics in Japan, the culture in Japan, which was all brand new. So the sector itself is new, but also having an investment in a company that's non-US and traded very differently and culturally very different and macro environment very different. It really consumed me because I started with a very large position. I kind of went all in out of the gate. And when I say all in, I put a large position on at the beginning. I wasn't necessarily, scaling up as we went up. And so I started talking about the position more publicly, not because I sought to do so, but Anders and I met at Bitcoin Vegas. He asked me to be on his show. I kind of reluctantly said, I don't really love the public speaking thing, but then I agreed to do it because Climb was, I was a big fan of Climbs and he was doing it. And so I was going to join them. And then you guys reached out and I was like, okay, sure. And so because people were asking me, I just became much more visible. And that also added to kind of my emotional attachment and involvement in the stock because I was like speaking about it. And so, in hindsight, because of that, I definitely did not manage the position as I probably otherwise would have when, red flags started to kind of appear, and we can talk about that. But I am still long MetaPlanet, Smarter Web, and MicroStrategy in my IRA. And I'm going to continue to hold them here and just kind of see how things play out. But it's definitely something that I think about a lot, and it does consume me because I'm just trying to figure it out like everyone else is. It's a relatively new sector. We've, introduced all these new metrics in terms of how to think about the companies. And yeah, I think I watched a Stanley Druckenmiller, or I read a Stanley Druckenmiller interview the other day. And, he said, I wrote this down, think deeply about where and how you went wrong. People who don't spend a lot of time talking about their failures and focus on their wins is a negative signal. And I really do, in a lot of instances, think about, where I've been wrong. I did that with Sequans, and I made a post about it, after we all kind of got run over by that pipe, like what I was going to do and where we were wrong on that. And I think about MetaPlanet because we've gone from, below my initial entry price, wrote it all the way up pretty quickly, and then wrote it all the way back down to kind of hear where we are. And so I asked myself, like, where have I been wrong? And should I hold it? Should I, increase my position? Like, what do I do with it? And how am I going to do this differently in the future? Always trying to learn from, mistakes as an investor. Yeah, so that's kind of where I am in conviction and emotion and expectation management. We're just, learning together as we go.
I mean, following up on that, I really appreciate just the being candid about it. I'll say for a specific piece is no one should be ashamed of knowing how pipe financing affects small cap stocks. I feel like more than I do, and more than Brian. Maybe Brian might actually have a lot more knowledge, but
no, but the pipe financing, which killed me on that, is I was so plugged into like the other pipes, and it was my own, I will say laziness, but I saw Corey, in a video, and he was like, there's no merger to worry about, no de-SPAC, blah, blah, blah. And so just in my head, I connected dots that implied there was no pipe. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't look into whether there was a pipe, and I bought the stock. And then a week later, the pipe unlocks and we got steamrolled. And so that's on me for not looking into it, knowing full well that if I knew there was a pipe, I would have never bought it in the first place.
And it's good education for everyone, is like, look out for those red flags, because that's something I feel like the average investor absolutely does not know. Is like, look, there's unlocks happening with these private investments.
Yes.
Watch out. People are looking out for themselves. They're looking to make profit. They're not looking out for retail investors. So as we're talking about learnings, it is good to also share these learnings with others.
Yeah, and I tried to be very vocal about both Naka and Strive on those pipes so that people hopefully weren't run over again with those two. There's another kind of company that has a pipe unlocking soon, ORBS. It's the Dan Ives one. And so I think people should be aware of that. I think, the pipes can be real, liquidity events, and you just don't want to be in front of them.
Yeah, and there's going to be more. I think the one thing that I'm certain about is that there will be more companies that are going to try to do some semblance of this strategy in the future. And we may, see things improve in terms of these companies that are established. But I definitely, we've seen more during sort of this, miserable summer, I suppose, in terms of new companies announcing their strategies and everything. So it's definitely good to make sure that we understand some of the mistakes that we've made as a community, maybe even on an individual level, but like do our diligence. And the information is out there, right? You know, in the Edgar filings and everything in the US, maybe it's a little bit more difficult for international companies that go public or, you know, change their statuses or things like that. But at least for these US equities, we can do that research. So one thing that you kind of alluded to, Khristina, was kind of some of the red flags, I guess, that you've identified for MetaPlanet. And I think that that might be a good sort of discussion point if you're willing to talk about some of the things that maybe you didn't like over the past 3 months since you last spoke with Jody.
Yeah, so, well, it was actually a red flag because I went back at the calendar and took a look. So it was a red flag. So I think we did our first talk in July. Was that right, Jody? It's like time frame. So the red flag for me, and it was, I think I was coming from it from a perspective of, okay, it's the first strike. Like, I'm not going to just immediately flip on a position because of one strike. But it was probably a big strike, and where I should have at least like trimmed or scaled. And I was vocal about this in the Discord, and I was certainly vocal about it with my partner when Simon, you know, was going back and forth with Jim Chanos in the middle of June and said, want some borrow. Like, that really bothered me. I didn't like that at all. And I was pretty clear in the Discord and here at home that he shouldn't have done that. And, you know, if I didn't have such respect for Simon and hadn't been in Vegas and, you know, met Dylan, you know, like I just, I probably would have at least trimmed my position at that point. Because it really, like, if you look at a chart, when that happened, June 16th, it was the absolute top. And so that comment bothered me. But again, I think I came at it from a, you know, one strike, or I just, even though I talked about it, I kind of didn't act on it and do anything about it. And then fast forward, you know, we had the international offering, which was announced on August 27th. And the stock was at $6.12. So we'd already kind of trended down. And there was a, you know, 2-week marketing period, right? And with any follow-on, you know that institutions are going to manipulate the stock price, right? Because they're going to drive the stock price down so that they can get a better entry price. Or short at the day it's announced because they know they have 2 weeks, you know, and then they can close the short at the time of pricing. And so it's not normal to have a follow-on offering with such a long marketing window. And so I just kind of ignored it, right? I was like, oh, this is what they're going to do. They're going to raise so much money. Institutions are going to eat this up. And so over a 2-week period, we went from $6.12. They priced it on September 9th at $3.75. So just using round number, you know, the stock was down significantly. And then they gave, you know, the institutional investors, you know, an additional 10%. And they raised, I think it was 285. They could have raised up to 555. They raised kind of in the middle, 285. So they didn't do the low end. They kind of did the midpoint at a very, you know, significant discount. And so what we don't have a lot of information on the international offering because they've been in this like quiet period. But I definitely have, you know, a lot of questions around it. And I have questions, the same with, you know, Smarter Web too. Like they just did a US raise with a single investor placed by a US bank. And so my question would be for Smarter Web, right? Like, was it strategically because a single investor was interested, or did they have this whole sales pitch and roadshow, but only one person came to the table? Like, I just don't know the dynamics of like how things were placed. And I think the same with MetaPlanet. If they marketed globally for 2 weeks, right? And they met with all these institutions, and, you know, we were talking a little bit before about how much institutional capital is there, and they only raised 285 million. Like, it just seems to me that Wall Street is not in any way buying into these business models. And so what does that mean? Like, are we just wrong in how we're thinking about it? Like, and I don't know the answer. This is just kind of like what I'm processing for myself. Like, why is Wall Street telling us that they're just not interested? And like, what are we missing? So that's what I'm trying to figure out for myself. Like, why are institutions not interested in these assets? And maybe it's because they don't understand Bitcoin, right? And like, we are all big believers in Bitcoin, and we think that companies acquiring the most pristine assets and being able to build these businesses off of Bitcoin makes a lot of sense because we believe in Bitcoin. But maybe they're just not there yet in terms of their belief in Bitcoin. But I just don't know the answer.
Do you think that the mNAV premiums, where, you know, above the net asset value of the Bitcoin that they hold, is a good trading firm, institutional trading firm, is going to see that and they're like, this is going to get compressed. Like they've seen markets like this where every premium gets compressed and someone's taking advantage of that profit, and that's going to be them. Like they're like, hey, this is the easy one. Do you feel like they're seeing it as like that's where their cake is, of like, oh, no way we can support a 10x mNAV?
I mean, I definitely think they're figuring out valuation metrics and how to, you know, profit by trading these stocks. And, you know, the reality is that, you know, the liquidity in some of these names makes it very easy for them to make money on the short side. And so, yeah, I think transparency with respect to all of these metrics, and, you know, it kind of works both ways. Like, we want these companies, we value as retail, like we value the transparency. But I also think there's a very fine line. And I think this was an issue with MetaPlanet, is an issue with MetaPlanet. You know, they evolved their moving strike warrant program, and, you know, they changed it. So it was like a 3-day window and gave out, like, you know, the levels. And I think in those instances, and when strategy gave guidance and then they kind of removed it in terms of how they were going to facilitate their ATM, like, you're basically laying the roadmap and saying, here, hedge funds, these are the metrics so that you can figure out the best way to short and manipulate our stock. And so I think in those instances, like, they need to be much less transparent, like, and not give the playbook in terms of the thresholds of where you're going to be using your ATM. And because that's just too much information. And this is the only sector that I can even think of that's so transparent. I mean, transparent in a good way, but then I think it can also work against you. I mean, if you look at like Palantir's website or Tesla's website, right? They're not like putting their valuation model up for you and telling you like what PE multiple they're trading at. And, you know, it's like, we're just like, here you go.
I guess interesting, you know, yes, the playbook's out there, but it does, I guess, make me sort of question directionally, does that mean that we're right? So these are sort of short-term games that somebody's playing with these stocks because the information's right there and it's transparent? Or, you know, are these things really supposed to trade at like one mNAV with just the tiniest of premiums? And, you know, people have talked about the dilution strategy of issuing more stock, just, you know, expanding market cap without expanding any actual value that I have. And I think, you know, you kind of alluded to this, but happy to have you say more. It's probably still an open question, but it seems like right now there's bigger money around to be able to manipulate these stocks. And I was, you know, listening to someone speak, and he mentioned something in a private conversation. He will remain nameless. The company will remain nameless, but this is an investor, not huge, but not small, who was moving a stock in terms of their buys in a day and didn't realize that their buys were moving the stock. And that was really interesting to sort of just hear in one of the names that we would all know. And so, you know, there isn't that much liquidity in some of these smaller players, but even MetaPlanet, which is basically the second largest of all these, what is the market cap now? 3 billion or something like that. It's still relatively small. And especially within the Japanese market, yes, that's a smaller market as well. So there's a lot of these factors, I guess, that go into it. And I'm talking too much, but what are your thoughts? Are we just early, or is this a broken strategy potentially, or is this manipulation, or all three?
I don't have the answer. I don't know yet. Like, I don't know if we're just early, or if, I just don't know. Like, I'm really struggling with why institutions, aside from capital, and capital is very important. I don't want to discount them, because they tend to be early and take very big long-term positions and tend to be right more than they're wrong, right? But why aren't other large institutions making similar bets? You know, there's many of them. Why isn't T. Rowe Price or Wellington or Alliance Bernstein or Neuberger Berman or any of these other large long only funds, like, why aren't they taking positions? And not that we need their validation and confirmation, but I'm trying to think through, like, okay, what are they thinking that I'm not thinking about, right? And so I guess, you know, one thing that's come to mind recently is, you know, the Bitcoin treasury companies, you know, following Strategy's playbook, right? These were businesses that were very much in trouble, you know, pivoting to adopt Bitcoin, which makes obvious sense, but then creating these new companies, right, to acquire Bitcoin, build Bitcoin products. But maybe it's not the Bitcoin treasury companies that are ultimately going to be the largest holders of Bitcoin and the ones creating and distributing products. Like, I just don't know. Like, could a Coinbase, for example, right, who has the platform and has the distribution and they own some Bitcoin, could they really quickly and easily scale up their Bitcoin and then offer their own preferred, because they already have the clients and they already have the platform? Like, doesn't necessarily need to be the Bitcoin treasury companies that do it. Like, and so for myself, I'm just trying to think through, like, what am I missing? Like, yes, I believe in Bitcoin. Yes, I think, you know, having a Bitcoin treasury makes sense, but that doesn't mean that the stocks are going to work. They've gone up and they've come back down. And so now kind of, what do we do to figure this out? Like, I think in MetaPlanet's specific example, and same with Smarter Web, you know, I still own them and I own them for reasons. I do think that, you know, MetaPlanet will be able to continue to increase their stack. And I think they've even doubled it since the last time, you know, Jody, you and I spoke. And they are on, you know, the cusp of introducing preferreds in a very yield-starved Japanese market. And I do think there is a good component of first mover advantage, specifically in Japan, in terms of their branding, in terms of being the ones that are educating on Bitcoin. And so I do think they have a real opportunity there. And that's why I've kind of stuck with my position in that company, because I think it makes a lot of sense. I also think that when they uplist to NASDAQ in the US, that'll be a positive catalyst to improve liquidity. They've recently hired a US-based CFO. Like, they're doing a lot of things. The problem near term has been that we just haven't heard from the company because they've been in this kind of quiet period, which I'm told or believe ends next week. So hopefully we'll get a lot more transparency. I would love to see, you know, filings hitting that this international offering led to institutions that we're just not aware of yet taking real positions and starting to think about scaling into these names, you know, near, intermediate, and longer term. But we just haven't had that visibility, right? And it would seem that based on how the stock was traded, so we priced on September 9th, pricing was at 375. The stock did trade up, you know, kind of after that, I think for like the first week, and then it's been kind of down ever since. So my hope is that they didn't allocate the stock at a 10% discount to institutions who then a week later turned around and sold it. My hope would be that the stock was allocated to really, you know, aligned long only money that wanted to make an investment, and they're still there and they're going to continue to build their position over time. But until we see filings and until we see like an update in terms of who's holding it, we just don't know. And then with Smarter Web, they have real catalysts too. They'll be, uplisting to the LSE. There's real index inclusion opportunities for them, which is a major liquidity event. And so there's reasons to continue to own, in my opinion, both of these stocks.
Khristina, you've mentioned around, and you appreciate the honesty around, having this attachment to MetaPlanet, the stock, the community, and there were certain like flags ignored of like performance because you were so tied to it. Let's say you weren't tied to it. Let's say you're completely objective. What is your process, and like what filings are you looking at? You mentioned around post roadshow, you're looking at everything. You're looking at the investors that come in and seeing what adoption is, how much investor interest. For those looking to learn about how to read through these different like SEC filings.
Yeah, unfortunately, I no longer have a Bloomberg, which is only somewhat recent. I retired from the business in 2019. And so, and up until that point, I was using a Bloomberg every day for over 20 years. And up until, let's see, my partner retired in June. And so up until June, I could have kind of borrowed his. But now we're both flying a little bit blind without a Bloomberg, but it was very easy to use that and look up like top holders. And so unfortunately, I don't have a great resource right now to look at like top holders other than like what my Fidelity will show me. But just asking people like, oh, you have a Bloomberg, can you, take a look and tell me what you see in terms of like the ownership changes and top holders. So that's one thing that at the end of the quarter, I'm going to be looking at. And hope maybe MetaPlanet will share some information with us, once the quiet period's over. Like we placed it with the 285 million was spread out across, 20 accounts or, whatever detail they're willing to share. We know that Nakamoto took a stake. We probably believe that capital came in to some extent, but as I was saying, like it was 285 million minus Naka's 30, that's 255. It's really just not a ton of money for these big firms. And so I'm just curious to see where the stock went and who's still holding it. Because performance also really matters for these institutions, right? And the deal priced in September, their quarter end would have been probably September 30th. And so did they hold it through the quarter? Are they still holding it going into year end? Like, as we read in the paper all the time, like institutional money is really struggling to outperform the S&P 500. And so they manage their risk and they don't allow small losses to become big losses.
Mm-hmm. Pulled up from Twitter.
That was actually going to be.
I was going to say real quick, Jeff Goldsmith was talking about, I don't know if you caught Dylan LeClaire with Tim Kotzman.
So Jeff Goldsmith is my fiance, by the way.
Oh, okay, yeah. I wouldn't have known that, but
yeah. Okay.
Just looking at the question, it's around.
Yes, a question. I don't see any questions.
I think it's in our comments, but he's like mentioned the new opportunities with large institutions, specifically international. And until MetaPlanet uplists to NASDAQ, many of these like institutions can't actually buy it.
This is true. A lot of U.S. institutions have mandates that they can't buy over-the-counter stocks. And so they need it to be on a NASDAQ or an NYSE in order to take a position. I mean, that is true.
Mm-hmm. Brian, sorry.
Was that the question? Or...
Oh, no, I was reading the comment and he... I didn't know you guys knew each other, obviously. So
yeah, he's in the office. He's in the back office. I told him he's not allowed to come out and walk behind me.
So he's bullish. He thinks that there's
he is very bullish. Yeah. He is very bullish. Yeah, he's been super bullish, super supportive. And it's funny because he retired in June, and we literally sit next to each other every day on a huge desk with like screens and trade. But we barely talk during the day because we have very different styles, and I don't want him to influence me, and he doesn't want me to influence him. And so we don't talk about positions that often, with the exception of MetaPlanet.
Mm-hmm.
That's fun and interesting. How people deal with that. Going back to maybe it's not a theme, but something you brought up a couple of times with, I guess, the big institutions and where are they with these companies. I think we've talked about a couple of the factors in terms of can they even invest in something this small or something OTC market. Also, you brought up the idea around keeping up with the S&P 500, right? So what is their benchmark internally? And this year for us, it's been a year of, Bitcoin, it's, the 4-year cycles, it's the treasury companies, it's the ETFs. And here we are at basically the same price we were at the end of last year. And so, we are a little bit in this bubble ourselves a bit, and we have had some new all-time highs and everything, but it may be too much of a risk, I suppose, for some of these firms to come over here versus invest in some of the AI companies or do something that's more similar to what everybody else is doing. So love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I can say with a pretty high amount of confidence that if you are a long-only mutual fund manager and your benchmark is the S&P 500, you are not making bets outside of the S&P 500. You are figuring out what you're overweighting and underweighting kind of within that index for the most part. Because if you take a position in MicroStrategy and it ruins your performance, like you're out of a job. You're not out of a job if you mismanage your weightings, but you're out of a job if you're taking a bet in a stock that is not a component. And yeah. I do think MicroStrategy getting added to the S&P 500 will be a major catalyst, not only for strategy, but for the overall sector. Because I think it forces people who do look at the S&P 500 as a benchmark to finally do the real work around strategy so that they can make an educated decision as to whether or not they're going to have a much larger or a much smaller position in the company. And so until it gets included, like they haven't been, that contingency of investors hasn't necessarily been forced to have to do the work.
Mm-hmm. One thing we're seeing, and the reason I pull this up is it's supporting your points of it'd be really hard. People get excited about getting like over 120, over 125, hitting 126,000, for Bitcoin. But, these are spikes, but there's also big drawdowns in there, in this past year. And one thing we're really trying to focus more on content is helping people to prepare for if it doesn't go to 180, if it doesn't go to 250, it doesn't go to 1 million, this year is like not getting caught up in trading so much that you get chopped up, because that's what happens to people is they're like, oh, I'm going to go all in. And then it just keeps chopping and they try to start shorting because they get bearish, they get discouraged. That's you should never short if you're a novice trader. So
even if you're an experienced trader, like I'm terrible at shorting stocks. Like I do short and I'll buy some puts here and there, but for the most part, like I'm just not good at it. My fiance is very good at it. Like he makes more money on down days than he does on up days. Like that's his vibe. It's just not mine. And for Bitcoin, for me, like Bitcoin is not an asset that I trade, even though there's a lot of ways to kind of trade it now. Like I kind of buy and hold Bitcoin, only because I believe in the asset and I feel like for myself, I trade plenty of other stocks and I have an opportunity to kind of trade that I don't feel like I need to do it with Bitcoin. So for me, Bitcoin is, buy, hold, stack.
That's probably a healthy attitude just for you and things that you've said. Just as you said, you got maybe this emotional attachment to MetaPlanet. My guess is that you have an emotional attachment to Bitcoin. So it might mean, and I don't want to say that you couldn't keep your emotions out of it, but it would just make it that much more difficult, right? Versus company stocks. Okay, I love them today, but I don't love them tomorrow when the management changes something or, sentiment changes or whatever it is. And I don't mean even just treasury stocks, but the stock you're trading. And I guess, you brought up strategy a minute or two ago, and, they've been doing this for 5 years now. And it seems like, this was a workable model, not without its drawbacks, not without its learnings over time. But I'm just trying to go back and think about the theses that I had for these investments, back in the spring when I was making them. And I don't see a lot, I guess, change there. What I see is sort of, details that I didn't know to look for, or, new parties that are participating in these stocks in a way that a company that's worth 100 billion can deal with, and a company that's worth 3 billion or less really cannot, right? Saylor's like, if you want to come short my stock, come at me and short it. He's publicly said something almost to that effect.
Right.
And
I don't know
that
either, just for the record. I feel like he's like the volatility is vitality, and we have the most open interest on our options, and short my stock. Like, I don't agree. Like, I love Saylor. I think he's amazing, but I don't agree with that particular narrative.
That both doesn't surprise me, but it also, to the comment that you made before, and again, I don't think we're trying to have a session where we're hating on Simon, but just calling out Chinos in a similar fashion, not probably the smartest move, because you have as much of a defensive pool as Saylor does to be able to weather that. And Saylor's also in a much different position, having weathered this multiple times over his career already. Not to say that with the hotel business and everything else that Simon has experienced, he is not, but I take your point and I agree, right? Sometimes things are better left unsaid, and it can be very difficult to do when you have conviction and you feel that you're right. And so, that's just very interesting. One thing that I also wanted to ask you about was, we've seen, I guess, the term DAT start to develop, because we're not just in Bitcoin treasury land anymore. So, you have BitMine immersion. I think there was a company, what was it? Forward Industries buying Solana for treasury. So I'm curious for you, Khristina, if these companies are at all on your radar, either as a trader or I don't think certainly as an investor, but like, do you think that there's money to be gained on those, as a trader, or do you think they're just like completely speculative, like altcoins generally? Because I'm not trying to question here your Bitcoin maximalism, because it truly rings out, especially every time we see you, you've got your Bitcoin hat on. So
yeah, it's actually kind of a problem. Like, anywhere I go and I try to like orange pill people, and sometimes I have to be reminded, like, we're going to dinner with our friends. Can you just please try not to talk about Bitcoin tonight? Like,
yeah.
Hey, I'll try. It's so hard not to. So in terms of the other DATs, I don't know anything about Solana. I just don't. When I came into Bitcoin through MicroStrategy and really, went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole because I was trading MicroStrategy stock a couple of years ago, and my girlfriend got a job there, and it kind of evolved. And so, Saylor educated me, and it kind of has stuck with me. Like, there is no second best, right? In terms of Ethereum, Tom Lee's not a dummy, and I can buy into the whole stablecoin thesis. But for me, more trading vehicles. There's certainly been plenty of opportunities to trade BitMine based on its volatility. I do have a short-term trade on BTBT, and that's purely technical based on the chart. I really don't know the company. And so for me, when I say, is it a trade, like, typically it's just a trade because I'm looking at the chart. An investment is something where I know more about the fundamentals. I know about the management. I know about the catalyst. I have a view on the earnings. Like, there's, much more involved when I put a position on to own it, versus just, I think this is a good entry and I'm going to buy it here, and my plan is to sell it there. And so I have traded some of the Ethereum companies. I haven't done anything in the Solana world. It doesn't mean that I couldn't. They're not on my radar.
Yeah,
for any Ethereum
probably
company, I was gonna say, like, I don't know. I've totally lost on like what the emission schedule is, or like how much Ethereum, is basically inflated in the supply at this point. But
yeah,
it makes sense to trade it completely based on like price action and the chart,
right?
Because you're a trader, right? You shouldn't be stopped from trading something, or people do it all the time in cannabis, like they'd be shorting Tilray, or they be longing Tilray because it would be beaten up too much, but they might not be an actual cannabis user themselves.
Right.
I have no idea how to value that. I think the 21 million in the hard cap on the supply at least gives you an idea of like there's going to be some long-term demand here. But
right, I totally agree. I have no idea how to value it. I've never really spent time studying or understanding it. And let's not be mistaken. Tom Lee's very incentivized, but he also got his shares at $4.50, right? And he got a lot of shares, and his friends and family got a lot of shares at $4.50. And so the stock is, because of his backing, traded much higher immediately, but he still owns shares at $4.50. And so, yeah, you gotta keep in mind, incentives. Yeah.
And there's a difference too, I suppose. And I knew Tom Lee before I knew Bitcoin. And so, there's that element of his reputation and everything. But I think some of the Bitcoin treasury companies, the founder-led companies, have really kind of done things differently than other companies where, people are kind of jumping in or starting something midstream, even if they've got a background, even potentially background in Bitcoin. And this isn't to knock anything. You'd mentioned earlier, kind of trying to build a company like Coinbase around Bitcoin. And I think that that's the vision that Jack has or has expressed for XXI, right? Very early, not even, finished with the transaction yet. But, knowing what he was building with Strike, that's not necessarily surprising. But the question is, does that scale? Does that work? Do you need preferreds? Are there other products we can do? And he's got good partners potentially with, deep capital access. And
Huge
so,
partners.
It's a question.
And I don't have a position in the company. I think for me, it's uninvestable until like the merger's complete and we actually know what the business is. And is there, I don't know, is there a liquidity event that we have to be aware of? And, I just don't know how to value it. I like Jack a lot. And I do think at some point I probably will have a position in his company just because I think he's, a unique thought leader. It's just not today. But he does have fantastic partners with Tether and SoftBank. The other thing he has is Cantor, which I think it's not a small thing that Cantor is literally at the table in all of these conversations with these other Bitcoin treasury companies. I mean, they were the co-lead on the MetaPlanet deal. So they know where the bodies lie. They know which funds are interested. They've also heard all of the feedback. So if MetaPlanet had 100 meetings, right? They know that 100 people were interested or 100 people weren't interested and why they weren't interested. And so they have all of this institutional knowledge that Jack now has. And so there's a premium to that.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. I don't know if you caught Adam Back had done a couple of interviews, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago on BSTR. And I hadn't really heard Adam talk about BSTR very much before that. And there was a lot of interesting things going on with that transaction, which is also a Cantor transaction, right? And these two companies are going to be coming in much larger in terms of their stack, right? They're either already or about on par with where MetaPlanet is today, which is, second after strategy amongst the companies that we're kind of talking about Bitcoin treasury strategy having stacked. Some people said a month or two ago, you want to start small so that you can have that yield, but we're going to see if size brings you other benefits. And that was also something that Matt Cole talked about with us a few weeks ago with regard to why Semler was a great transaction potentially for Strive because of just getting to that size to get to preferreds, right? So I just mean just in terms of the size. There's lots of things we can comment there if we want to go down that rabbit hole.
I'm not that controversial.
Fair enough. I think if I was looking...
One thing I'll just kind of say without mentioning any companies in particular, like for me, shareholder alignment is, very important. And I think when you look into a company, I'll use ASTS, AST SpaceMobile, which is my largest position. Founder-led, CEO, takes $0 in compensation and has never sold a share, with the exception of like a caller he did on 3% of his stake like a couple of years ago. He knows the value of his company and, is in it for the long haul. I think with some of these Bitcoin treasury companies, you have to really take a look at, management alignment and compensation, right? And so if you're the CEO of a Bitcoin treasury company and your stock's been absolutely fucking hammered and you're making $1 million a year and you just got like a $17 million bonus, and you have all of these other bells and whistles in your compensation plan, I don't know, do I want to give you money as an investor? I think some of the Bitcoin treasury companies management compensation is a little bit out of whack. So something that as an investor you could look into and grok and figure it out.
I agree with that. I think that is something that people are starting to call out, that, as we see, these treasury companies, want to pull in the Bitcoin community. They're going off the Bitcoin ethos. They're using all the same terminology, sponsoring conferences, etc. Is, someone called out, they're like, oh, hey, with Naka, there's executives getting paid, $1 million+ salaries in fiat. And that's not necessarily what Bitcoin's about, which it should be taking payment in Bitcoin or not taking payment at all, but you believe in the company and you believe the asset that they're buying and they're leveraging up to buy is valuable enough that your equity stake in it should be plenty for you to receive compensation for what you're doing. So they should be more stewards of this, levered vehicle to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible, rather than, hey, I'm going to extract as much value out of like public equity shareholders. This is a good segue, I think, into investing outside of Bitcoin, which we wanted to ask about. So a lot of people in Bitcoin typically haven't talked about it too much, but since performance of either Bitcoin itself going sideways or a lot of these companies, people are opening up a little more and saying, hey guys, we shouldn't miss this AI wave. There's a lot of demand. There's, power demand. There's companies that are like NBIS is one that we want to ask you about. There's companies that Bitcoin miners that for very good reasons have gone into the AI trade of, power, buying up chips and also powering these data centers. Let's start with just like overall sector, like what sectors are interesting to you? And then let's get into like some of the individual names just to see what is interesting to you.
Well, I've always been kind of a growth investor, and I've been an investor that likes to put money into stocks that I personally believe in the story, right? And so, AST SpaceMobile, which is my top holding, I can really believe in the story. They are a satellite company that is launching satellites so that, the whole world will be able to connect their existing phone, download videos, text, broadband with no new hardware. And it'll just be an add-on to AT&T or Verizon or Vodafone, who they already have strategic partnerships with, right? Where it's oh, do you want, satellite connectivity, and you say yes. And I don't know what the pricing is going to be, or if AT&T is just going to give it to you, or if it's $5 extra a month. But this solves a real global connectivity problem where there's a lot of people that don't have cell phones because they don't have connectivity, or there are people who have really shitty cell phone service because they don't have connectivity. And they've basically invented this market, and that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think the total addressable market is enormous. And I think this will be a company that in the future is ultimately talked about among the likes of, the Mag 7. I think it's a game changer. So that's one of my top holdings, and I like it because I believe in the story. So I tend to, buy stocks where the story makes sense to me and I can understand it. And that's one of them. I took a position just this week in a company called Kraken Robotics, which is basically a partner with, or not a partner, a supplier to Anduril, which is, Palantir's, call it little brother. And so it's subsea technology, basically marine underwater, and they do batteries among other things. And it's just, conceptually something that makes a ton of sense to me. It's a call option on Anduril, which is private, that, I would love to have shares in. And so again, I look for things and for stories, and then, that's where I start. And so those are, two stocks that I really like right here. ASTS actually hit $100 very recently, and almost like Bitcoin, when it got to 100, you saw people sell. I think people had in their mind that, Bitcoin gets to 100,000, and we saw a lot of people sell. ASTS got to 100, and a lot of people sold, and then they announced a convert. And so there was a liquidity event there. But the stock's off, call it 30% in just about a week or so. And I think it's, not financial advice ever, but I like the entry point here.
Yeah. I think when you say story too, I think even that like last soundbite you said on Kraken Robotics of, having a call option on Anduril, a private company, there's not that many, I'd say, companies that most people know that are disrupting these massive defense contractors, Lockheed Martin and any other ones, Halliburton. And so people have obviously gotten really behind Palmer Luckey. He was on Joe Rogan. People like his ethos, what he stands behind, and how he makes America competitive, in future wars. So just that snippet itself, it makes me want to go, oh, I need to go look up these guys and see what they're doing.
Yeah. And I think, a good way to like identify opportunities, right, is to like pay attention to your kids and talk to your kids and what they're into. I remember, several years ago, my son was like into Roblox, right? And so I started to like, oh, should I look at this stock? Like, tell me about Roblox. And, I made good money in it. I sold it too soon. It was one of those things where I bought it, I made money, I got out too soon. And I reposted something today that was basically like, the biggest wealth you make is just like buying and holding on to companies. Like, hold your winners, right? Let your winners keep winning. And I was trying to look up the other day, like my cost basis on Amazon is under $20 a share. And I just held it. And like, so for a company with AST SpaceMobile, like, and that's one that I've been talking about since maybe January, and the stock was under $30 a share. But I don't have any intention of selling it. Like, I literally plan to hold this like I've held Amazon and other stocks, like, because I believe in the long term, and I can weather these short-term drawdowns because I believe in the fundamentals of the story, and I believe in the management to deliver and get us there.
So maybe to bring back circle, you kind of described how you're looking at AST SpaceMobile and your Amazon stock and maybe Roblox. How are you feeling in the same way about the treasury companies today, I guess? I think I invested, and I think, number one, my time horizon was years, not months. Yep. So while I didn't foresee this drawdown, I knew that it was possible with Bitcoin. And if Bitcoin went down by 60 or 70%, we were going down by 80% in these stocks. But, are these stocks you still think at the moment? And I know that I don't want to say questioning your thesis, but you're trying to build resiliency in the original thesis you have. But how are you feeling about that in the long run?
I think time's going to tell. And, I don't know the answer. I can't say that I have the conviction that, these companies are going to be the companies, because there just seems to, like, if they're going to be the companies, like, why doesn't anyone else think so? And so that's just what I'm struggling with. Like, if they are going to be the companies, then absolutely, like, we're all going to make tons of money over the long term. And I do think, strategy is positioned to do that. I do think MetaPlanet in Japan is positioned to do that. I question some of the smaller ones that don't even have scale yet, when sentiment is so negative and the flywheel's broken. Like, if your published plan is that you want to get to 1,000 Bitcoin, like, that's not a lot of money. Like, any company can turn around tomorrow and buy 1,000 Bitcoin that has, capital and real cash flow. And like, and so I have a hard time with some of the smaller companies because I just don't think they're going to get there, or that it matters if they get there. I don't know what 1,000 Bitcoin does.
So one question
Yeah,
I have for you, that one of the hardest things people do or lack or can't do is sell appropriately when a particular investment that isn't a long-term investment. Never sell your Bitcoin. We're talking about, let's say, a stock. Let's say it's AT&T. Let's say it's Delta Airlines. Something that you might, be trading because you see COVID coming, subsiding, and you're like, travel is going to resume. What are some ways to learn that? That is one of the hardest things. You want to let your winners run, but you also don't want to hold on to something too long.
Yeah, I mean, for an investment or a trade, I mean, obviously for trades, I use stop losses. Like, people say it's okay to take, you should never have a big loss, right? Mm-hmm. You should, big wins are great. Small losses are okay. Everyone's gonna, have a small loss, but you should never be sitting on a huge loss because you should never allow yourself to get there, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of exiting investments, I haven't figured out the perfect science around it. And it's something that I still struggle with, as I look at my MetaPlanet position and, I think what would make me sell it, right? And I think the next 6 months are going to be pretty important, only because in the next 6 months, I want to hear from management again. Like, we've been in this window of no information in a period where the stock has been absolutely hammered. And so I really do want to hear from management to help reinvigorate my conviction in everything that I know they're doing behind the scenes, but I just kind of want to hear it. And so I want to see them roll out preferreds. I'm not naive to think that it's not going to be like the miracle pill overnight. One thing that I've learned about the Japanese market that I was wrong about when I entered the trade was I went into the trade with a misunderstanding, thinking that Japanese investors were all in MetaPlanet, all in Bitcoin, super supportive. That was this big cultural movement. That was my misunderstanding. That's absolutely not the case. Japanese investors are very timid. And I don't say that in any way in a derogatory way, but they're not the same. I didn't realize there was such a difference between US investors and Japanese investors. And it was just my own ignorance, right? And so I'm not naive and understand that when MetaPlanet launches the preferreds, I don't think it takes off overnight. I think there's going to be this period of education and distribution and education. And because I think whatever the stat is, and I'll probably misquote this, over 50% of Japanese money is sitting in savings accounts that yield nothing, right? Mm-hmm. And so, yes, that's the opportunity for preferreds, but it's also, you have to change the mindset that you should take it out of your fiat account that you're earning nothing with and invest it. And so I think Japanese culturally are not investors. And I didn't realize that, I misunderstood that initially. I thought they were more than they are.
So. I think that's a good observation from the group, because there was a lot to say that there's a lot of people in Japan behind these stocks. But I do think that there potentially is a bigger opportunity. I don't think as big as we were making it out to be a few months ago, where the preferreds in Japan could actually run the playbook for the US for strategies to actually have more impact. Because even if you look at where MetaPlanet is today, I'm trying to think of where we were at the start of the year, but January 2nd, it was 224, and now we're at 290 is what I'm looking at right now. So it's up 30%, which for a Japanese equity is probably huge, right? And so, what do preferreds do compared to the other options that they have there? Whereas, a 3 or 4% difference may not make that big a difference in the US, especially with all equities that we have to be able to invest with and things of that nature. So remains to be seen. I think we should be, maybe cautiously optimistic at best on a particular piece, but I'm hopeful that it will go.
I think education and distribution is key. And I think that's the same for strategy. One of the things that I've talked about is the fact that I think, strategy really lacks the right distribution. When you look at their deals and who's on the books and who's placing the allocations. Like they're not really partnered with great retail distribution right now. And so, yeah, Cantor is great, but Cantor is not putting this in front of any retail, right? And so like, why aren't they doing some partnership with E-Trade or with Robinhood or with SoFi or, someone that could help market STRC as an alternative to, a low yielding savings account. And so they have to get the distribution. Education needs to go beyond, our echo chamber on Twitter. Saylor posted something the other day, which was like, are you guys for like a little video clip about, the 10.5% on STRC and, without being disrespectful, kind of replied like, this is great, but like, you need a TV commercial, right? Like, sending this message on Twitter does nothing. We all know this, but like, why isn't there like a commercial on the Super Bowl that talks about how Bitcoin outperforms every single asset over time, right? Like, where's the Bitcoin education in America outside of us getting together at a conference or talking about it on Twitter? One of the things, I went to get a manicure, a month or so ago, and I was talking to the woman, and she was from Ukraine. And I asked her, oh, it's so hard. Is your family there? Do you send them money? How do you send it? Do you know what Bitcoin is? And so she's like, so I was trying to like orange pill her a little bit. And she's like, oh, do you have a blog or do you post about it? And I was like, well, there's a big community on Twitter. And she's like, oh, no one's on Twitter. And it's true. Like, we're on Twitter, but like most people are not. They're on TikTok and they're on Instagram. And so who has the energy? And it's not me. Who has the energy to start putting this message out on Instagram, on TikTok, and educating people on the value of Bitcoin? And because someone needs to.
We're working on it. We just finally downloaded TikTok. I did not want to have them steal my data.
You're working on a Bitcoin dance?
Yeah, I'm going to leave that to Sean. But yeah, for like 10 years, I was like, or however long TikTok's been around, I was like, I will not download this. They're definitely going to steal my data. And they probably still will. But I do think there's a really good audience that totally agree. Twitter's an echo chamber of the people that know the same thing, and you're preaching to the choir. And a lot of them already hold spot Bitcoin and like, hey, I don't need additional exposure in the sizable way.
Right.
So I agree.
But the masses need to be educated on Bitcoin too. Like, Bitcoin outperforms the S&P 500. Like, how do you get people to own Bitcoin or learn about Bitcoin? Like, you got to put it in front of them in a way that they want to learn about it.
Yeah, totally different approach. And I think for us, we're finding, really good creators that are, I think, younger, that are passionate about Bitcoin, but, haven't.
Professor B is amazing. I love her.
Huh?
I love Professor B.
Yeah, Professor B. Halston Valencia was on the podcast recently, and has some people, I think, recording Australian girl on L. She's going to be on Friday or tomorrow. And yeah, I think there's a lot of people in college too that, like, to get people to care about it, it goes a long way. Also very interesting, I think, of like partnering with Robinhood or partnering with E-Trade, any of these popular trading apps. I mean, they have a clean interface that you can say, hey, we'll give you 1% or 2%, or you can take this like spread on it and then Stretch, could provide that back end deposit yield.
Right. But then that led me to my comment earlier, like maybe they just create their own. Like, I just don't know. Like, I don't know what's all involved. I do think Strategy has a huge advantage because their stack is so big and they already have the products. And, but I don't think like over time, the banks are going to do something, right? Like, I think the easing US regulation, like, works both ways. I think it's a huge benefit for Bitcoin. I think a lot more people will be educated and adopt Bitcoin because the banks are now incentivized and allowed to talk about it in terms of a product, in terms of an investment allocation. And, you know, I just looked up the other day, I have it here, like how many banks have announced that they're now doing things in the space, right? Like Citi just announced last week that they're going to start custodying Bitcoin next year. And so I do think there's going to be this evolution where it takes time because there's regulations and there's compliance and there's education, and it just doesn't happen overnight. Like when you first start learning about Bitcoin, it doesn't happen overnight. Like I'm still learning. And so I think with these banks, you know, they're just getting started, and it's not just one, they're all getting started. And I think in time, we're going to see a lot more innovation. Like Saylor certainly led the charge. And I think, you know, no one's going to catch him in terms of his stack and his ability to create products because of the size of his stack. But I'm not naive to think that there's other companies out there that can buy Bitcoin, build products, distribute it, have very, very smart people to do that. And I think that it's only a matter of time, and it's just how much time.
There's so many organizations out there. There's so many banks, right? There's so many insurance companies. And even if strategy had the absolute best products and the absolute like biggest demand for those products, they couldn't keep up with the demand that we had here in the US. And that's just, you know, part of what's there in the world, right? Like to think that one company could serve the, you know, high yield savings account needs of America is just naive if people think that. And I've never heard anybody say that, right? But there's going to be room for multiple winners on that piece. My question will be, what are the bank's incentives to over collateralize? Are they going to be putting the proceeds from that into Bitcoin so that it kind of becomes a reflexive flywheel? Or are those dividends or return to shareholders or new skyscrapers in Manhattan or any number of different things that they might spend their money on? So I agree that they're going to get involved. I agree that there's going to be others of these products. But the question becomes, are they as attractive in the end? But that may not matter, right? It may just be that JP Morgan knows how.
Maybe the distribution and the branding is what matters. Like
exactly. Yep, 100%.
JP Morgan, I was looking at, was it Raoul Pal and then Dan Moorhead had a video, and I think someone we probably all follow quote tweeted it, and it was basically a little clip saying like JP Morgan released a statement this morning or released an email this morning to their clients about, you know, the debasement trade and getting on board. And these guys that are like, you know, crypto investors more so, but they were talking about, we've been talking about this for a long time, but to see that embrace of like, hey, you know, we're traditional finance. We don't love, you know, Bitcoin and all of this, but we do believe debasement is happening. Yeah. I think is where you can't get into that trade and ignore Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin has to be some part of that allocation. So they might just package it up differently and just put the ETF in there quietly, but they're going to have to allocate.
Yep. Yep. I mean, it's an interesting exercise to ask AI, and I did it, and I thought I printed it out to have it, but literally what steps have, you know, major US banks made in the Bitcoin or crypto space, you know, over the last year. And it's like literally like every bank, every announcement that they've made. And it's just like, it's just getting started. I mean, which ultimately I think is very good for Bitcoin. Right. Yeah.
And I asked AI last week, I asked 3 different models, what's the best form of money? Just that straight up question. ChatGPT came straight back. Yeah, it came straight back with Bitcoin. Perplexity hedged, I think, between Bitcoin and gold. And then I think Grok basically ended up with Bitcoin, but with different caveats about diversification or something like that. But, you know, that's just that question. Someone else said it's very clear when you ask it about Bitcoin. And I'm just like, well, you shouldn't ask it about Bitcoin because then you're putting your thumb on the scale. Sorry, Khristina. Yeah.
But it's true. I mean, it is the best form of money. And, you know, I don't go around spending my Bitcoin, but the art behind me was showcased in Bitcoin Vegas. and they had an auction, which I did not win. But I reached out to the artist afterwards, and he was willing to commission for me. And he's in Italy. I think his handle's at Boat Tipping Club, just to give him a shout out. And, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, he wanted paid in Bitcoin. And I was like, you know, pay you in Bitcoin. I don't want to sell my Bitcoin. I don't want to pay. No, but the moral of the story is I did pay him in Bitcoin, and it was absolutely the easiest international transaction I've ever executed, right? So much so that he was like, okay, well, when, you know, we figure out the shipping and everything, you can pay me in fiat. And like, he sent me instructions for some numbers to a bank. And I was like, I'm just paying you in Bitcoin. Like, I don't even know how to contact my bank to set up this transfer of, you know, whatever it is. So I'm just paying you in Bitcoin, you know, and there's no currency translation. It happens immediately. Like, it is literally the easiest way to pay, especially cross-border.
Yeah, that's what we want to see more of. I think with the companies, it's like, it's more than a balance sheet asset. You know, we want to be, you know, educate people on like, hey, here's, you know, when you should spend it. It is an investment, but you know,
I think it's very interesting what Block's doing. Jack Dorsey, ticker XYZ, and with the small and medium-sized business community, he's actually just allowing them to accept payment in Bitcoin and settlement in Bitcoin. And I think that's one step in terms of educating the masses too. When you have all these small businesses now able to, you know, accept payment and get settled in Bitcoin, like, that's fantastic.
Yeah. So winding down here, coming up a little bit over an hour.
Yeah.
Khristina, final thoughts, final questions. As we round out the year, are you bullish? Are you bearish? Are you shaky with, you know, rare earth metal restrictions with China, with Trump, Xi Jinping meeting? You know, what's your overall thoughts right now?
On the overall market, I'm bullish. We have rate cuts. We're in a very, you know, pro-market administration. I do think we continue to trend higher overall in the stock market. The caveat being, I'm typically a perma bull. And so, you know, I think I heard Jesse Myers on, was he on Anders the other day? And he's like, you know, a perma Bitcoin bull. And I'm like, I'm kind of a perma market bull and Bitcoin bull too. And so I just, you know, I have to hedge myself now with what I say, but I do think we'll be higher.
Your fiance, what is he feeling right now as the master short?
He's bullish too, but he is such a trader. I mean, he trades in and out of stocks all day, every day. He'll be in and out of the same position, you know, 3 times. And that's just not my style. And so he doesn't even necessarily have to have, you know, a view between now and year end, because that's just not how he manages his money.
Yeah. Brian, I'll let you chime in. Any feelings right now beyond just treasury companies, but market overall?
You know, I think it's always been for me a long-term thesis. So, you know, I am new to Bitcoin this year. Jody knows that. I publicly said that on X. But I wasn't expecting sideways price action from March to now, right? But I got in March when I think we were at 82, was sort of my initial buy. And then I bought some into the 70s just because of what was going on. So I'm doing okay overall on the Bitcoin purchases. And then the treasury stocks, not as much, but I didn't plan to exit them this year. Like, I didn't plan to exit them even if we were way winning until they were, some of them are in a taxable account, so long-term capital gains. We've got some time to run. And I think that, you know, the one thing that I'm becoming more and more sure of is the cycle is broken, right? If we're not seeing the sentiment from retail throwing Bitcoin up right now, this is probably not just a repeat of the 4-year cycle and maybe the top isn't in. Again, I haven't been there before, but that's just kind of what I'm thinking about. It doesn't mean that we're going higher right now. It doesn't mean that we're, you know, going to go higher in 2026. We may just chop sideways and go up a little bit. Maybe this is a more mature asset as a result. And then looking at gold and looking at the AI stocks, they look a little hot to me at this point. So I don't know if that's going to last forever either. So those are my initial thoughts, but I'm really not taking any actions, just buying Bitcoin when I have extra money at this moment.
Respect. I'll say, yeah, shout out to our friends, Henry and Danny, who I chat with a lot and have worked with. We just talk about trading and markets a good bit. And Henry brought up the good point that Danny was very bearish on, what's going to happen the next 2 months. But Henry brought up the good point that BlackRock themselves bought $5 billion worth of Bitcoin at 105 when it dipped, recently when there was like liquidations. And I think with them buying that much on their own balance sheet, not just for like IBIT, and it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot dumber trades, I think, at the moment, like Palantir at like 585, PE ratio. You're counting on a lot.
But people have been arguing that about Palantir when it was at 100 times, right? And so like the market has told us that people don't care about valuation with respect to that stock. And if you would have sold it based on valuation a year ago, 2 years ago, like you'd be kicking yourself.
Yeah. So like treasury companies, we're learning. They're all unique, and all these metrics you try to apply to them.
I think with Bitcoin, though, I think, a major catalyst, I mean, Vanguard kind of hinting that they're going to pivot and allow their clients to purchase Bitcoin is really enormous. I think it's really enormous. I think that could be a very major catalyst. I know my, future father-in-law, we went to visit him a few months ago in Florida. And, the reason he still was kind of coming around on it was because why won't Vanguard let me buy it? And he's a Vanguard guy, and he's not going to transfer his Vanguard account. And I think there's this huge contingency of people that are like that. And so I think that can be a really monumental event, like sentiment-wise, but also demand-wise. And I think Jesse Myers from Smarter Web put out a really good piece the other day, just in terms of the money printer, and the thought being that what we're seeing in gold is basically gold sniffing out the money printing before Bitcoin, as it did back in 2020 with COVID. And Bitcoin ultimately ended up rallying 6 times, but the printing started in March, and Bitcoin didn't start to move and inflect until the 4th quarter. And so there was this delay. And so, his view was that possibly what we're seeing with the rally in gold is only, so that Bitcoin will eventually kind of follow and catch up. And that possibly the whales are, trying to calculate and time the cycle. And so their recent selling has been, kind of keeping the spring a little bit coiled, but ultimately that'll let up, and, we could be off to the races.
Yeah. I mean, even for me, the word debasement, we were talking about this earlier, more people, I think, generally outside of Bitcoin and gold in these communities have at least heard the word than 6 months ago. And so people are starting to think about why everything in their life is getting expensive, right? And you hear it all the time about everybody's complaining about how something is more expensive than it used to be. And so if you hear the word debasement, maybe you're thinking about those things as well. But we just haven't seen where they're going to make the connection over to Bitcoin yet. And it's going to come because of all the things that we know. So it's again, still an exciting time to be a part of this, right? You go back and you hear people who are OGs in like 13 and 15 and 17 and those cycles, and talking about the ups and the downs and everything like that. We'll be looking back at this year in 2025 and talking about it in 2020, in 2030, and saying, remember that time, that was either tough, or we learned our lessons, or whatever it is that we take away from all this. But, I said, I think yesterday in a response, and maybe I think it was on your post, Khristina, that I'm not doing anything different at this point, right? Nothing's really changed for me. Even with these stocks down 60, 70, 80% in some instances, depending on the day. I believe in the long-term. I think if Bitcoin does move to 150 or 180, these stocks have to look very different. I think that, there's other things that could happen, in terms of acquisitions. Like one thing that I've thought about in my mind, and I don't think either party's interested, but Saylor would love to have preferreds in Japan. Why doesn't he buy MetaPlanet, right? 3% or 4% of their market cap. I don't think Simon's interested in that. I don't think that Saylor's interested in that at the moment, but like it could make sense at some point if the stock gets so depressed. And other people talking about other unlocks. Do we sell the Bitcoin? Do we give out special dividends? Do we trap the shorts in various ways? And, one of the other things I've thought about personally was should these companies hire short seller advisors? Not people who are working for short sellers, but people who used to say, yeah, if you do that, this is what we're going to do in response, right? If you say that publicly, we got you here. Because I don't know if they're thinking about all those things as we're going through all these transactions, as you pointed out with the transparency. So we'll see. Learning process, right? So
yeah. Well, Khristina, really appreciate you joining. It's awesome to have you back, and appreciate the raw candor on your experience. I think a lot of us that are Bitcoin Treasury investors that haven't sold or did sell at a loss are looking to also just understand, think through, hey, what did I learn from this? And like you said,
we're all figuring it out. and that's what we get together and we talk and we communicate. And this is new for everyone, and it's never financial advice. So thanks for having me back. And I appreciate the ability to follow up from our conversation a few months ago.
We'll have you again in the month, and I think the market's going to look different, and I'm very excited about that.
Hope so.
Yeah. All right. See you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.